Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show. I'm Ted Bonnet. Phil, my partner in crime, is back east still. He should have been back by now, but because of the fires, he made a good decision to stay back east. Today, we are going to talk about the fires. What we want to do is give you as much information and knowledge as we can, something that isn't obviously being repeated on the major media outlets right now as far as current situation. We're going to be talking to a seasoned wildfire firefighter, Bryan Thompson. He's going to talk to us about their perspective on this fire, what they do, how they deal with wildfire behavior. He's a good friend. We've talked about it over the years, and it's really fascinating, the science behind wildfires and how you mitigate them and how you manage them. So hopefully there'll be some interesting insight into that for you as well. But we're going to start with Dr. Peter Kalmus, who is a climate scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. JPL is very near the monstrous Eaton Fire that has devastated Altadena. In fact, Dr. Kalmus lived in Altadena and moved away 2 years ago because he saw what was coming. And he wrote an op-ed piece that ran in the New York Times on the 10th of this month entitled, "As a Climate Scientist, I Knew It Was Time to Leave Los Angeles." Dr. Kalmus, thank you so much for taking the time and speaking with us.
I should say I'm speaking on my own behalf. And also, to say that I saw this coming, that's an overstatement. I didn't expect this to happen, at least not this quickly.
So you're familiar with, obviously, Altadena. You lived there for 14 years. You've been in the media because, you are outspoken about climate change denial, if you will, and how, it's coming back to bite us pretty badly now. And Altadena, of all places where you lived and you loved and you felt you needed to leave 2 years ago because of the increased risk. The topography of Altadena is, as I understand, I'm not terribly familiar with it, but what I understand is sort of like a bowl that's cut. It's like a canyon bowl that's cut into the mountain a little bit, so it really created a bad situation for combustion. Do I have that correct?
Well, it just feels like it's nestled in the foothills overall. It's kind of sprawls amongst the foothills into various different bowls. Mm-hmm. But it's quite close to the San Gabriels, and the Eden Canyon kind of thrusts down into sort of the core of Altadena down towards Pasadena. I don't know exactly right now why Altadena in particular, like Altadena and the Palisades were the two biggest hits, but it's not really that surprising. Palisades is also kind of nestled in the Santa Monica Mountains.
Plus, they haven't had a fire there in a long time. They had a lot of growth. You really have to live in Los Angeles to understand just what Santa Ana winds are. They're incredible.
I remember, I think it was 2013, we had some really strong Santa Ana winds in December. I don't think it was nearly as dry as it is right now. You guys have had 2% of the normal rain of this rainy season, so everything's just bone dry. Yeah. And I saw a quote from a firefighter. It's going to be fascinating to hear, your listeners hearing from the firefighter that you're going to talk to. I heard a quote. I can't remember who it's attributed to, but they could have put a fire truck in every driveway and it wouldn't have mattered.
It's unfortunate that people are compelled to point fingers and cause blame. I don't know why that is. Why it was so politicized. Obviously, it's a sign of the times. But when you get into the realistic aspect of this, again, getting back to Santa Ana's, I think you certainly are more qualified to discuss the nature of the Santa Ana winds. But when you have something like a 100-mile-an-hour Cat 1, Cat 2 wind event, what Santa Ana's are, if you want to explain it to people, you think these hot winds coming off the mountains are because of the sun. It's not. It's the molecular activity of the wind, the air molecules being compressed as it falls from the Great Basin of Utah and comes in over the mountains and gradually loses altitude, compresses further. By the time it gets to the last row of mountains, like the Santa Monica Mountains, it's super charged, and it's just like a vacuum in terms of sucking up every bit of moisture in the soil and the air, and then it's blowing 100-mile-an-hour winds. So it's like they use the term blowtorch. And
yeah,
I mean,
like a hairdryer, just like going across all of Los Angeles. Yeah, it's called adiabatic heating. And if you've ever seen like gas expanding out of a canister, for example, pressurized gas, like out of any kind of metal canister, it gets very cold. Mm-hmm. This is the same process, but operating in the opposite direction. So as that extremely dry air descends down to a lower altitude, it gets compressed and then it heats up. So you have this very relatively warm and like you said, bone dry air, mm-hmm. And then it's hitting the already bone dry kind of tinder of grass and shrub. The last 2 years, of course, have been pretty wet. So you get a buildup of grass, and then you have this ultra dry year, record hot summer drying things out, and then you get these really strong Santa Ana winds. And then there's constantly sources of ignition, right? This is something I don't think I hear people talk about enough, but you're always going to have little sparks coming from cars, cigarette butts, little pieces of glass, maybe kind of like lying on the ground, sparks from cars driving by with trailers, whatever it is. But it's those conditions of the fuel mainly, and then the winds. When you do get that spark from maybe it's from an old electrical wire or transformer, once that spark goes into the grass, it's just kind of game over. So that's the relationship to climate change, right? So if there are any arsonists here for these fires, it's Exxon and Chevron and Shell and BP, or maybe more correctly, the executives from those corporations.
Yeah, I definitely want to speak about the big picture here. I mean, getting to your point again about ignition, I spend time in the mountains as well, and we had a fire that was very dangerous, and it was sparked by a chain on a trailer that was just hanging too low, and the chain hit the paved surface. Just that started a fire that took out a lot of land. So that's how volatile things can be. And that wasn't even a Santa Ana condition. That was just, typical summer weather. Now, Southern California is a desert. We hydrated it. We man over nature. We carved out this picturesque, idyllic place, but it's artificial. It was something that man or humans created through irrigation. And then as the population grows, we just get into situations where people are building willy-nilly into the mountains, into these brush areas. I mean, Malibu is considered a fire canyon, as I understand it. I mean, it's something that's just part of nature. The long-term aspects of climate change and how we got here, certainly the fossil fuel companies have accountability issues. They knew through their own science decades ago that this was going to happen, and they suppressed it. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, I think that's such an important part of the story. And I've been, trying to make sure everybody knows that part of the story, of that deception from the fossil fuel industry, because I think they should be held liable. And I think maybe so there's already a lot of lawsuits being brought against fossil fuel corporations for various reasons and from various plaintiffs. But I think the more that we do that and the more that we revoke their social license, the more that people realize that, yes, fossil fuels are causing the planet to overheat. That's doing things like changing how much water the atmosphere is able to hold, right? So a hotter atmosphere holds more water, it sucks more water out of the vegetation. I've seen this referred to as the atmospheric sponge, just getting bigger. So that's kind of a very quick explanation for why we're getting some more wet years and then some more dry years. So those kinds of impacts, and then the flooding and the storms that we've been seeing and the heat waves, all of that's getting stronger as the planet heats up at about a degree Celsius, roughly every 3 years. Right now, it's been accelerating. It used to be every 5 years that we'd go up a tenth of a degree Celsius. And these impacts will continue to get worse as long as we burn fossil fuels. And I think it's worth blaming these corporations that made a conscious, intentional choice to systematically fund disinformation campaigns for the last 50 years, to give donations to politicians to block action on climate and to fast track new fossil fuel projects. They made that choice. They could have made the opposite choice. They could have said, wow, in the 70s, our own scientists are telling us that our products, oil, coal, and gas, are heating up the planet, and that's going to be really bad, and cities are going to burn, and cities are going to flood, and storms are going to get worse, and it's going to impact our food systems, and it's going could kill hundreds of millions or even maybe billions of people eventually if we let this go too far. So we're going to work with world leaders. We're going to let the public know that we have to transition away from fossil fuels. That's an alternate universe that we don't live in. That's what I think most good people would have done if they were in the fossil fuel industry in the 70s. But instead, what we get is this anti-science, deceptive disinformation campaign to cast doubt on the science, to do this like both sides media that we've seen the last couple of decades, and really prevent the public from, keep the public confused. Don't let them know that we have to end fossil fuels, because then it's very, very hard to elect politicians, to have elected officials, especially in high office, who are able to urgently address climate change. If the public doesn't know, it's very hard for a politician to just suddenly say, hey, this should be our number one issue. We got to stop climate change. The public's going to be like, hey, I've got all these other issues that I care about, and they vote that person out.
Back when President Carter was in office, he put solar panels on the rooftop of the White House, and he tried to make changes. He tried to tell people we have to calm down our usage. It's not a free ride. And he was derided. He was laughed at by the Reagan administration when they came in. They took the solar down right away. This is sort of like, as you said, that this is not a new normal, but in a sense, these forces are trying to create what is a new normal. So let's talk about science. You said that what we're seeing today and across the planet is only the beginning. How much worse is this going to get if we continue our current path?
It's hard to quantify that precisely. I think, if probably a kind of a decent way to gauge how bad things are going to get is to think about how much less bad things were 5 years ago or 10 years ago, if you can, and then take that amount of badness and add that to what we have now, and you'll sort of get a sense of what's coming in 5 years from now and 10 years from now. But it's hard to do that, especially because these kinds of impacts often sort of kind of join together to make something worse. You might get a really, really bad heat wave, for example, that then, and you've had a drought previously, and then that heat wave kind of contributes to make an extremely bad fire in, late summer, for example, that maybe isn't even driven by Santa Ana winds. So that would be an example of kind of like climate impacts synergistically adding up into something, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But also, I think there's another problem here, which is the systems are very nonlinear. The climate's very nonlinear, and how climate impacts interact with human systems is very nonlinear. So I think, I feel that these fires in Los Angeles represent a sort of tipping point where you kind of have a bunch of dials. Like you got the dial on drought, and you got the dial on heat. You've got the dial on climate whiplash, that the wet years earlier. Maybe it's unclear if the Santa Ana winds are getting more intense, but you've got maybe these four dials, and they're gradually getting turned up every single year, and then suddenly, boom, you're able to have this kind of a fire, right? And maybe that same kind of tipping point thing could affect, agriculture, our food system, for example. So maybe it's okay until suddenly it isn't, and it's very hard to predict exactly where that tipping point is.
I mean, that's a great point. We're pushed over 8 billion people on the planet.
Yeah.
And the question is, how many of these billions of people are going to lose their lives over the next decades if we continue on this path? And there doesn't seem to be a political expediency here. I mean, obviously we're a petrodollar economy, and we have been since the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it's fundamental to our existence. So it's not an easy thing to switch away from. But you made a point that was also deleted from the New York Times, edited out of your piece, was that, we all remember that even Presidents Biden and Obama, they boast how much oil and fossil fuel energy we're providing, we're surging. And, of course, the new regime's coming in and they're talking drill, baby, drill. The president-elect is actually still calling climate change a hoax. How do we change course if this is what we're facing, this kind of denial?
Yeah. By the way, I might have gone a little too hard on the New York Times there. The original piece was too long, and
they had to cut for space.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
The piece, I do. I have been wanting mainstream media to sound the alarm much, much harder for a long time. I will say that, and I feel like pretty much all of the mainstream media has been failing. For example, I pitched an op-ed to the New York Times, basically to the effect of everything is at stake with climate change.
Yeah.
So it's very hard to get the sort of the super urgent message out to the public, through mainstream media. But I think the piece in the New York Times had a huge impact, and
sure.
We're really happy with how it turned out.
And it is great that the New York Times did do this, but we're facing really new challenges in the media environment as well to get the word across, to basically cultivate common sense.
I agree. I mean, this is my this is the first step to me, and kind of when I think about how we could change society and rapidly transition away from fossil fuels, which is what we need to do to save as much as we can still save, right? The cause is fossil fuels, as hard as it's going to be. And thank God that we've got solar panel electricity being the cheapest form of electricity now, right? So we should be just going full bore towards solar for sure. And I think a lot of the old utilities, a lot of the fossil fuel industry, they're trying to block that, right? Because they don't want the gravy train to stop. But
they're also getting on new gravy trains. Sorry to interrupt, but Exxon evidently is not pleased with the Trump's plan to curtail these programs because they have a big business investment in CO2 capture. As I understand that Texas has a very robust renewable energy grid growing there. I mean, is that accurate?
Well, the carbon capture thing is a scam, and it's a distraction. It's frankly, you get energy by burning fossil fuels. That's what drives our economy. To suck the carbon dioxide, you can suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The problem is you have to run the energy in reverse, that energy engine. So you have to put in a huge amount of dollars to produce energy and then suck that carbon dioxide out. So until it won't make sense really to do that. I mean, I'm not opposed to researching it, but it's very hard to imagine that being viable at scale ever. And then if you think about the intergenerational crime component of this, it's sort of like we're saying, oh, hey, we can emit now. And then our kids, you can spend, half of your entire GDP trying to pull our carbon dioxide out of your atmosphere because you're desperate to make your planet cooler. I mean, it's a huge moral injury, and it hasn't been thought out well. And of course, the fossil fuel CEOs love it because it's a distraction. It's way away from them to even make money off of a distraction. It's a kind of sleight of hand, and it's just I'm disappointed that so many seemingly smart people otherwise are falling for this.
Interesting. So you can run, but you can't hide. The expression is somewhat apt. You left Altadena and you went to North Carolina. And North Carolina was just hit terribly by climate change-related storm and flooding. Firestorms are like hurricanes. Is L.A. tenable in the long term?
Well, no place is safe. I think the path... Some places are maybe going to get hit earlier. Some of those places, maybe you can predict what those places are that are going to get hit earlier. Some of them you can't predict. Nobody had Asheville on their climate bingo card. That was supposed to be a climate haven. Right. Same thing with the Pacific Northwest. But Phoenix, I probably wouldn't advise anyone to move there right now. Miami. And then, poor Los Angeles, beautiful Los Angeles. It's going to be, I guess, interesting, maybe is one word to to ascribe to that. I know it's tragic, but how things are rebuilt, where they're rebuilt, what kind of new fire codes there are, how the insurance industry responds. It's going to be an extremely complex process to kind of to sort this all out.
I think about what will be the first uninhabitable cities. Miami, because of storms and saltwater incursion and sea level rise. Houston, for all the reasons above, plus the fact that there's no zoning, so whenever there's a flood, you're in a toxic waste dump. Phoenix, because it's just too damn hot. I mean, are we going to, New Orleans, which is below sea level, are we just going to see this sort of southern part of our country become gradually uninhabitable if we don't change our ways?
Probably, yeah. And then many, many other places too. Like that's why we have to change our ways. And then to go back to the theory of change, the first step is, and I don't know how we do this first step, it's a very hard step. I think it's going to come about precisely from these sorts of climate disasters. But we have to get information out to people, real information that, for example, this is going to get worse. Here's how it's going to get worse. This is caused by fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel industry has been lying and blocking action for 5 decades, right? That all that information has to get out to people very clearly, so they know what the stakes are, they know what the cause is, and then they don't get distracted and they kind of like vote for elected officials and hold them to account as they address that root cause. It's going to be tough, but that's the first step. The getting that information to people, waking the public up, which is why I'm a climate activist, because my hope was that we could create a sense of public urgency before things got this bad.
Right.
But we didn't succeed.
Well, it's
I've been arrested 3 times.
You have.
Civil disobedience was the best way for me, especially a climate scientist doing civil disobedience. It's sort of kind of putting your money where your mouth is, right? And people they notice that, and it cuts through their denial. Like they
if we can only be more proactive rather than always reactive, because it just puts us behind the 8 ball. Can you?
We're kind of a reactive species at some
yes,
level.
It is. Yes.
Our society is reactive. I shouldn't. Capitalism, extractive colonial capitalism, with its quarterly system of profits, is extremely reactive.
Does our hope lie in the youth that are or who are waking up to this nightmare and saying no? What's our hope?
Well, I think we haven't, as a society, made a unified, concerted effort to solve this yet, which sounds like not hope. But if we can if we can start to learn to work together, if we can stop, bombing the heck out of all these places around the world, and we can stop with the culture wars already, which are pointless and just hateful. If we can come together and say like, oh, we all need a planet. Like whatever country we're in, however we think about these different cultural things, issues, we all need a planet, we all need food, and we're in big trouble. So let's kind of set aside these squabbles that we have and work together to really transition away from fossil fuels quickly. I think we could do it quite fast, because when we humans set our mind to something and we work together, that's how we've survived kind of thus far, but on much smaller scales of humanity, right? And over the last 50,000 years as tribes. But we need to work together. That's where our power lies. That's where our innovation is. That's where we can really fix this quickly. How we get there is not as clear to me.
It seems like we have another detour coming in the next week with
we sure do.
This administration coming in.
I this is probably crazy, but I do kind of fantasize that working class Republicans might say to themselves, the farmers, for example, might be like, hey, I can't grow my crops anymore. It's too freaking hot. Or like, this city's burning in front of our eyes. Like, Trump, you're telling us this is a hoax, but obviously it's real. So stop with the gaslighting. And then suddenly, like, the Republicans stop their denying, and they actually start, suddenly the politicization over climate goes away. It just doesn't seem like it's an issue that only Democrats should be able to address.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. It's an economic issue.
It's tragic that I think when people have been wrong for a long time, it's very hard for them to be like, oh, we were wrong, we're going to change our minds. That's not something humans are super good at.
Well, we've been, sitting here for a week, not knowing what's coming next is very disorienting. Been able to kind of lose focus on what's going on in Washington right now. But we hear politicization on the Republican side, certainly saying they want to put strings attached to helping us out, which is really goes against what their supposed Christian morality espouses. The thing that really is also offensive is that California sends about $90 billion with a B, billion dollars to the U.S. Treasury more than it takes. So when you have all these states like Florida hurling insults towards us, remember who's paying for your federal relief.
Yeah,
and let's understand we're in this together. To use this for political gain, especially in a negative way like that, is anything but Christian and anything but good. You're right. I don't know what it's going to take to bring us together on this. I hope we can.
It seems like that's really the first step, though, doesn't it? Like we have to somehow come together and start. That's what it's going to take to really deal with this.
What are you going to do that might be inspirational for other people to hear? I mean, obviously you are committed to making change.
I don't know yet. I mean, I'm working on a book right now. I'm planning to keep doing civil disobedience. It seems like the costs of civil disobedience, the consequences might go up dramatically under this new administration. So I'm hoping that the public will start to recognize that climate activists, while maybe inconvenient if they're blocking the road or if or maybe they might make you clutch your pearls when they throw soup on the protective glass on a painting. I mean, now look, we're getting whole art museums going up in flames, right? So yeah. I hope people can realize that the climate activists are doing this out of love. They're being sort of despised by society, but they're actually heroes. So support climate activists, and then maybe, we won't see them going into prison for long years just for trying to stop the growing inhabitability of our planet.
Yeah. Your book is called Being the Change, Live Well, and Spark a Climate Revolution. You're offering solutions to help forge a more hopeful future in the face of climate change. Dr. Peter Kalmus, again, thank you so much, and please keep up the good work.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
I'm so sorry about your loss. Even though you're gone from Altadena, you certainly weren't forgotten, and you had a lot of relationships and connections there. And like all of us, we've lost people. We've had friends who have lost things and everything, and we're sorry for that. And wish you all the best.
My heart goes out to all of Los Angeles, but especially to beautiful Altadena.
Thank you, Dr. Peter Kalmus. Take care. You're listening to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show. I'm Ted Bonnet. Phil is out counting coconuts in Fort Lauderdale and avoiding the smoke wisely. He'll be here soon. And also, by the way, all of our shows are available for playback on our website, sexyboomershow.com. And what we're doing today is putting the mirth aside and dealing with the reality we're all facing right now. It's just been an amazingly difficult week. You should be wearing a mask out there, a good mask like an N95 or 100, because there is significant particulate in the air, and it's not benign. It's the remains of homes, chemicals, just all sorts of artificial materials. It's not just ash from the forest. And it creates real health issues. Bryan Thompson has decades of wildfire fighting experience, including in Southern California. He's brilliant and well-trained and knowledgeable about wildfire, its behavior, how to protect ourselves from increasing threat. Hey, Bryan, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for the chance to talk.
We're buddies, and we've talked at length about the nature of wildfires. And it's really fascinating, as horrific as it is, the behavior of the fire and how they act and fighting it. Hats off to the media here, the local news media in L.A. I mean, L.A. leads the culture in so many ways. Our firefighting apparatus is second to none. We had help from everywhere. Countries, states come in with their fire engines to help us. And then the local news outfits. We had terrific coverage in real time watching these fires. And we could get to see literally the Chinooks coming in and dumping 3,000 gallons of water with absolute precision. And then large airliners coming in and dumping enormous amounts of Phos-Chek, the fire retardant that's colored red so the pilots can see where they're dumping it. You're one of those people that you'll see up on the hilltop. You are an engine boss for wildland fire engines. You're a crew boss when you're dealing with more than 20 people with hand crews. Firing boss, which is a directing firing operations. A helicopter manager, where you're running the crews. A helibase manager, where you're basing the helicopters and keeping them, I guess, fueled up and full of retardant and all of that. Ramp manager for retardant planes. Small incident commander. You're a task force leader. You also have, when in the off season, you do prescribed fire burn loss, and you just recently became qualified to be a drone pilot, which is really fascinating because you can get up and see these fires. You can even, with your drones, drop fire to create fire lines to head off blazes. You've really seen it all, and thank you, by the way, for what you do. I mean, I know on the off season, I see you coming home from some wild mountain that's not on fire, but you're just walking through the mountain, determining, well, this brush needs to be cleared, what kind of a risk this poses for surrounding residents. So you're really on it. I wanted to ask you some rudimentary questions about the firefighters we're watching on television with shovels and picks, and they're scraping dirt. And you look at the size of the fire. How does that even help?
Yeah, thanks for that nice introduction. The folks on the ground are really what make it happen. The boots on the ground, right? All of the aerial drops, the helicopters, the big retardant planes, the big air show that everyone loves to watch, myself included, and be a part of is even more fun. Although it gets kind of crazy. It's it's its own special airspace mess. Organized chaos, if you will, and that's why it's so important that private drones stay on the ground during fires. You know, you all saw the pictures of the scooper that hit one
from Canada.
You know, fortunately, no one got killed. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the air show was impressive, and they're pushing the limits of aircraft close to the ground and doing amazing things to help the firefighters on the ground, right? And that's what it is. It's help. Ultimately, the fire is put out by people on the ground, right? It's putting the wet stuff on the hot stuff. It's separating the green stuff from the black stuff so that the green stuff doesn't become black, right? Mm-hmm. And that's creating fire lines down to mineral soil. So scraping off all the vegetation, you know, on a fire break, you know, 18 inches to 5 to 6 bulldozer blade widths wide, depending on the situation. You know, it's the people on the ground getting it done.
Little as 18 inches of a break could stop a fire. Of course, Santa Ana winds are a whole other trick bag because the embers are what's causing the fire. Right, exactly.
And so the you know, just a simple hiking trail can stop a fire. The trick is that it needs to be down to mineral soil. It needs to be a clear break, right, with no organic matter in there. Mm-hmm. And then there needs to be no aerial transmission of fire. So embers is what we're talking about, right? And essentially that fire line will stop the fire. And then how far we put out the fire inside of that and into the black area inside of that determines whether it's contained and controlled, which are different. You know, contained essentially means whether that fire line, how far around the perimeter it is basically what that means. Controlled means, okay, now we've got the perimeter and we've extinguished everything interior far enough that we're confident that it can survive whatever comes its way, right? You still might see some islands burning interior, see some smoke coming out.
That explains why we're not seeing... Yeah, so that's why at a distance we're not seeing any smoke. It looks like everything's clear, and yet the Palisades fire is only contained to 17%.
Right, because you still got interior stuff, right? And then you get some wind, you get a flare up that starts a tree on fire, and suddenly, boom, you're off to the race. That blows the embers across the line and into some fresh green, and then you're off to the races again, right? Yeah. And so it's a combination of stopping it on the ground and then working your way interior enough that you're pretty confident that that whatever winds are coming, or in the future, it's not going to be problematic. And if it is, that you can catch it easily enough, and it's not going to be a lot of that. Maybe a spot here or there is one thing, but multiple spots taken off can quickly overwhelm available resources.
We saw the Hollywood fire briefly ignite. That was in Runyon Canyon, which is right in the center of Hollywood. There was a striking image of the fires, the Magic Castle, which is a landmark here in the Hollywood Hills, backlit. Because the winds were cooperating, they could get airborne, and they put that fire out like it was just remarkable work. That was the problem with the Palisades in Altadena. The winds were so strong they couldn't get up there. You can't fight wildfires with municipal hydrant systems that are designed for a house or two. It's just not on the same scale. And people are
right. When you get flame lengths that big and flaming fronts with putting out that much energy, a rule of thumb is that a ground firefighter can't get close enough to the fire to do effective things when the flames are roughly more than about 4 feet high.
Yeah,
right? Yeah. You start getting into the 3 to 4 foot range, and I tell you what, man, it takes it out of you quick. You start bonking really fast when you're working out there as hard as you can, fast as you can. You start getting near those flames, and it gets hot, and the oxygen content goes down, and you're breathing smoke, and you bonk quickly.
Wow.
And so, anything over about 4 feet, you need air support. You need helicopters to drop water to knock that flame down so that you can get in there and mix in the water, because the water will only hit the top layer, and there's things below that are still burning, and so it needs to be mixed in, and you got to separate the non-burning stuff from the stuff that's burning, and that requires chainsaws and digging and things like that. It's really hard work.
What about the people that stayed behind to try to save their homes with a garden hose? There were a couple of stories like that in the Pacific Palisades where a guy did save his house and 2 neighbors' homes because he stood behind and fought the fire with. He had an extra thick garden hose, so he had enough volume, I guess, to do it, and the hydrants didn't run out by him. What's your take on that?
He's fortunate, one, that he had enough flow, right? Because if everyone was doing that, right, that pulls the pressure of the system down enough where maybe you're just getting a trickle and you're not actually able to spray, right? When all the valves are open at once. And so that's a concern, right? It's also a concern of maybe his home was well built, which is a huge factor in these Southern California fires. Maybe his home was well built and he cleared the brush around his house correctly, and did Firewise landscaping. That's a great resource to look at, is firewise.org. Will get you the information you need to start addressing the issues with homes and surrounding landscaping and stuff like that. And so when a home is built fire strong, right, and the landscaping is good and minimizes the amount of heat impact that the structure takes, and is able to handle flying embers, then that's a possibility, that people can do things, set up sprinkler systems around the perimeter and hitting onto decks and whatnot, and turn it on and walk away.
In a firestorm like we had in Pacific Palisades, I mean, that water would just be evaporated in a heartbeat. He was lucky. Because
absolutely.
Because we're talking about 3,800 degrees, 3,500 degrees. We saw images of aluminum vehicle wheels in Malibu, and you see puddles of melted aluminum. And aluminum has a high melting temperature, so that's extraordinary. You're not going to, garden hose isn't going to stop something like that. Now, what happened last Tuesday night was extremely unusual, thank God. But we're still in what they're calling a PDS, a particularly dangerous situation, which is actually a designation that has only been used a couple of times in the past, and it's been used like 4 times this week because there's obviously an escalation of danger here. Let's talk about the future. Here's what I'm thinking about Pacific Palisades, and I assume Altadena. I'm just more familiar with the Palisades. That's prized real estate. It was built over 100 years' time. There was no consideration or concern for this kind of an event at the time. So you had old architecture that was vulnerable, to say the least. The government, what they're offering to do, if you sign a waiver in Altadena, they will come in, the federal government, FEMA will come in and literally safely remove all the toxic materials, which are substantial, and dispose of them properly and leave you a clean, scraped lot ready for development. California officials and city officials have promised to cut red tape to get this built. Now, the question is, this is an opportunity. So when you look at the Palisades flats that completely got burned out, and you're basically scraping it off and starting completely new. Should we be doing things like putting all the utility infrastructure underground, including electric and maybe larger water pipes? I don't know if that would make a difference. Should we be building fire-resistant material homes? We saw one in Pacific Palisades that was in a landscape of total disaster, and it was literally not even singed, and then xeriscaping, because there's still in a wildland urban interface. Are there ways to build back better?
Yes, there are. However, it's important to note that the vegetation surrounding the city, right, and into the city and those areas that have burned, that is chaparral, right? Which is its own unique ecosystem. Chaparral has it's great for a lot of things. It's wildlife habitat is wonderful. It does a lot of great things, and it just rips when it burns, right? Mm-hmm. Once the fuel moisture drops below a certain level, the resins in those plants become explosive, right? Mm-hmm. It's on roughly a 30 to 150 year fire cycle. So that's how often it's expected to burn, mm-hmm. just regularly, right? And but you don't, and so prescribed fire and things like that and fuel breaks help, but they're much less effective in a Santa Ana situation, to the point where they're not effective at all, right? And so while doing those things, fuel breaks and prescribed fire and that type of stuff is important, it's not the end all be all. If you take a look at the photos that are everywhere now of what's going on and the burned houses and whatnot, if you take a look close at those, you'll see not just the destruction of homes and lives, but you'll see green trees surrounding them. Right?
That's right.
And so, it's important to remember that there's a great article in the LA Times. Let's see, it's called "Inconvenient Truths About the Fires Burning" from mm-hmm. 2 fire experts on the 11th, I believe, and it's well worth a read, because what they're talking about there is that yes, the fire started in the wildland, but this is a fire adapted ecosystem there around all over Southern California, right? It's always been there. Fire's always been there.
62 Bel Air burned down. It happens.
Exactly. It's going to keep happening, right? It's the nature of that ecosystem, the ecosystem that you all love, and it's a great place to be. The problem is that it's now an urban fire, right? Think of the Chicago fire, the Great Chicago Fire, right? Mm-hmm. The supposed cow that kicked over the lantern, right? That entire thing, the entire city burned down because of poorly built structures. Right? Not resilient to fire, not resilient, able to transfer fire from one structure to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, right? And the way that the city is designed, the cities there are designed, the houses are very close together. And there's no way, once your next door neighbor's house starts on fire, there's no way that you can save your house with a garden hose. You can save it with a fire truck a lot of times, right? And so it's an urban fire is the problem. Mm-hmm. And so building codes, right, have to improve. Enforcement of those codes have to improve. Yes, there needs to be a fire break, and you shouldn't build on the outside of the road, right? Because those houses are much more susceptible to start than the ones on the inside of the road, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And so we need to really rethink how we relate to fire.
Do you think
our
that
relationship to it? Because fire is natural.
Do you think that insurance companies, prompted by the government, will say, "Look, you want to get a loan to rebuild? You're going to have to build to a new code because we don't want to pay for this a second time."
I think in our current situation, that's going to be a major driver.
Yeah,
because of the need for housing, we do need more housing, right? In our current situation. And money's always an issue, right? But we can't keep doing this, long term. We need things to be more resilient, and fire is going to keep happening. And so we need to build better. And we need to eliminate some of those communities that are not defendable. We need to stop building in bad places too.
That's going to be a tall order, but there are already lawsuits pending against the Southern California Edison Power for not de-energizing lines that were exposed to the winds, started fires. A common thing, but we all want our juice. When we build a second grid, can we bury these lines instead of having high tension? Is that even feasible? And finger pointing that's going on right now is that there wasn't enough money or resources to clear brush ahead of this fire, especially in these communities. Given the Santa Anas, do you think that made a difference? Do you think we could have prevented this?
I think it's more important in the communities than it is in the wildland. Because of the nature of the chaparral ecosystem, we have to stop houses from starting on fire.
Right. And
so that means clearing brush, creating defensible space, building more solid homes, and all of that. And yes, creating some fire breaks, right? Mm-hmm. There may not necessarily be the end all be all, but all of those things together will help us create a more resilient system. And yep, I agree. Walking away from certain areas that shouldn't have been built in the first place is not easy because there's property lines and people own property, and it's difficult to make that argument. Mm-hmm. But we don't want people to die, and we don't want to put money into things that are going to be continually failing.
Well, Bryan, thank you.
On a long-term basis.
Bryan Thompson has decades of wildfire fighting experience. We do have to change our ways. If you can get an air purifier, it will work wonders if you can afford it. And I heard there were some programs to help people afford that. These are the new realities we have to face and prepare for. Our hearts go out to all of the people who have lost their homes. It's just been an awful week. We've had friends of the show. John Goodman lost his house in Pacific Palisades. We're with you. We love you. SexyBoomerShow.com. I'm Ted Bonnet. Phil Proctor will be back. I promise. Until then, stay safe.